Have you ever noticed that people seem to change the moment they meet you? Someone who was laughing freely suddenly becomes more careful with their words. A stranger avoids eye contact. Someone else apologizes for something that doesn't even need an apology. It happens often enough that you eventually start asking yourself, why do people react like this around me? Most people assume the answer is simple. Maybe you just look intimidating. But psychology suggests something more interesting. People don't react only to who you are. They react to the story their brain creates before they actually know you. And sometimes, that story is completely wrong. Society usually has a label for people who create this reaction. You're arrogant, cold, unfriendly, or you think you're better than everyone else. But those labels often come from first impressions, not real understanding. Our brains are wired to make rapid judgments about strangers because uncertainty has always carried social risk. When someone is difficult to read, the mind naturally fills in the missing information. That doesn't mean the conclusion is accurate. It simply means the brain prefers a quick explanation over no explanation at all. And that's why the first sign surprises so many people. Sign 1. People become quieter around you. You've probably seen this happen without realizing it. A group is talking comfortably. Everyone is interrupting each other, laughing, telling stories. Then you join the conversation. Nothing dramatic happens, but the energy changes. People start choosing their words more carefully. The conversation becomes slightly more formal. Someone who was speaking confidently suddenly begins explaining themselves in greater detail. It's subtle, yet it happens often enough that you notice the pattern. Most people assume this means others don't like them. But that's usually not what's happening. Psychologists have found that people constantly try to predict how others will respond during social interactions. The easier someone is to read, the safer the conversation feels. But when someone's emotions are less obvious, the brain becomes more cautious because it has fewer clues to work with. Think about the people you instantly feel comfortable around. They're expressive. You know when they're amused. You know when they're confused. Their face tells you exactly what's happening. Now compare that to someone who listens quietly, thinks before answering, and rarely overreacts. Neither person is more judgmental, but one is much easier to predict. The other leaves room for interpretation. And whenever the brain encounters uncertainty, it naturally becomes more careful. That's why people often grow quieter around you. Not because they're afraid of you, but because they're trying to avoid getting you wrong. Sign 2. People apologize more than they need to. Maybe you've heard sentences like these before. Sorry, that probably sounded stupid. Sorry, I'm talking too much. Sorry if that didn't make sense. The strange part is, you never looked offended. You never corrected them. Yet they behave as if they're being evaluated. This isn't necessarily a sign that people think you're harsh. It's often a sign that they're monitoring themselves more closely. When someone can't easily read another person's reactions, they pay more attention to their own behavior instead. Every sentence gets mentally reviewed before it's spoken. Did I say the wrong thing? Was that too much? Researchers studying first impressions have found that people quickly judge traits like warmth and confidence from very limited information. When those signals are unclear, people often become more self-conscious because they're unsure how they're being perceived. Ironically, you may be the least judgmental person in the room, but because your reactions aren't obvious, other people become more aware of themselves than they are of you. And that's a very different kind of intimidation. Sign 3. People assume you don't like them. This one usually catches people off guard. After knowing someone for a while, they suddenly admit, I honestly thought you didn't like me when we first met. Your immediate reaction is confusion. We barely spoke. Exactly. The brain dislikes empty spaces. When it doesn't have enough information about someone's personality, it fills those gaps with assumptions. A neutral face becomes a negative face. A thoughtful pause becomes silent judgment. A quiet personality becomes emotional distance. None of those conclusions have to be true. They're simply the brain's fastest explanation. Think about your first day at a new school or a new job. Within hours, people had already decided who seemed friendly, confident, funny, or distant. Not because they truly knew anyone, but because the mind is constantly creating stories from incomplete information. Here's where it gets interesting. The people who eventually become your closest friends are often the same people who later say, I completely misjudged you. And that's your biggest clue. The problem was never your personality. It was the story people created before they had enough information to see the real you. Sign 4. People rarely challenge your opinions. Have you ever shared an opinion in a group and noticed something strange? Everyone agrees. Or at least, no one disagrees. Later, you find out someone actually had a different opinion. They just never said it. It's easy to assume that's because people respect you. Sometimes that's true. But sometimes it's because they can't predict how you'll react. Before disagreeing with someone, the brain quietly estimates the social risk. Will this become awkward? Will they take it personally? Will this start an argument? When someone's emotional reactions are easy to read, those questions are easier to answer. But when someone stays calm, speaks carefully, and rarely gives away what they're thinking, people often choose the safer option. Silence. Not because your opinion is unquestionably right, but because uncertainty makes disagreement feel more expensive than agreement. Sign 5. New people stay distant until they know you. Have you noticed how the people closest to you describe you very differently from people who've just met you? Your friends might call you thoughtful, funny, easy to talk to, but someone meeting you for the first time often says, "You seemed really serious," or "I wasn't sure how to approach you." That's because first impressions aren't designed to understand people. They're designed to make quick predictions. The less information someone has about you, the more they rely on appearance, body language, and facial expressions. Then something interesting happens. A few weeks later, they're laughing with you, sharing personal stories, talking as if they've known you for years. You didn't suddenly become friendlier. They simply replaced their assumptions with experience. Sign 6. People say, "I thought you were arrogant." If you've heard this before, you're not alone. "I thought you were arrogant. I thought you hated me. I didn't expect you to be this nice." At first, those comments seem strange. After all, you weren't trying to appear distant. You were simply being yourself. Psychologists have found that people form surprisingly strong impressions from only a few seconds of observation. A neutral expression, confident posture, quiet behavior. That's often enough for the brain to create an entire story. The interesting part isn't that people misjudge you. It's that nearly everyone builds these stories about everyone else. Most of them simply never get corrected. Yours do, because people eventually discover they were wrong. Sign 7. They later admit they were intimidated by you. This is usually the moment everything finally makes sense. Someone smiles and says, "Honestly, I was intimidated by you when we first met." Not anymore. Only in the beginning. That one sentence explains every sign we've talked about. The quiet conversations, the unnecessary apologies, the emotional distance. They weren't responding to your intentions. They were responding to uncertainty. And uncertainty changes behavior. The human brain has always preferred prediction over confusion. When it can't clearly understand someone, it creates the most believable explanation it can. Sometimes that explanation is accurate. Often, it isn't, which leads to a completely different way of looking at yourself. Maybe you've spent years believing you're intimidating. But what if that's not the right word? What if you're simply harder to predict? Those aren't the same thing. One describes your personality. The other describes how other people's brains respond when information is incomplete. And that's an important distinction, because identity isn't just shaped by who we are. It's also shaped by the environments that taught us how to interact with the world. Some people learn to express every emotion immediately. Others learn to observe before speaking. Some became comfortable thinking first and reacting later. Over time, those behaviors stopped being choices. They became personality. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because repeated adaptations slowly become identity. So if people have misunderstood you before, that doesn't automatically mean something is wrong with you. It may simply mean your personality takes longer to understand than your appearance. And maybe that's the hidden truth behind all of this. The fastest impressions are rarely the deepest ones. Because people don't always react to who you are. They react to the story they create before they know you. And sometimes, the real you is far more interesting than their first impression ever allowed them to see. If you've ever been called intimidating, cold, or hard to read, I'd love to know which of these 7 signs felt the most familiar to you. Leave it in the comments. Not because there's a right answer, but because you'll probably discover you're far less alone than you thought. And if you enjoy exploring the hidden psychology behind everyday human behavior, subscribe. Every week, we uncover another pattern that helps explain why people become who they are. Until next time, remember this. People don't always see you as you are. They see you through the lens of what they expect. Understanding begins the moment those expectations finally give way to reality.